Final Fantasy is a game series that pioneered JRPG game design in the late 80s through the 1990s, during which time it has set trends, tropes, and game design conventions that have inspired other games and franchises to this day. Indeed, it has established its distinct brand of adventure with summonable deities, rebellious fellowship quests, and hybridized high science fantasy over the years, which has appeared to exist in a vacuum, and yet, if we take a moment to step back, look at the historical and pop cultural context that Final Fantasy emerged in, along with the interests of its personnel, we may be able to glimpse the myriad of inspirations that make their way into the games. Kicking off, a cornerstone of Final Fantasy that has always intrigued me most is the summonable beings, variously known as Espers, Eidolons, Aeons, or indeed Guardian Forces over the course of the series. These summonable creatures are intriguing as much by how they are redesigned and reimagined for each game as they are for their function both within battle and story. Looking to where the concept of summoning a supernatural deity to one's aid might come from, a few sources spring to mind. Firstly, we have Greek myth, tales that are rich in heroes being helped or hampered by the gods on their adventures, such as Perseus being aided by Athena and Hermes on his quest to kill the Gorgons, Odysseus being aided by Athena on his adventure home from Troy, and so on. Indeed, the literary device of Deus Ex Machina, God from the Machine, is derived from these plot devices in Greek theatre, and in terms of inspiration on Final Fantasy, it's not beyond the realms of possibility that there's some influences here, since even the earliest Final Fantasy games have references to mythological creatures and figures. But looking closer at Final Fantasy in the context of it being a Japanese game, looking at it in the context of collecting summonable combat allies being uncannily like other Japanese media such as Pokemon, Digimon, and so on, there's something much more particular to Japanese culture about the summons as they exist in Final Fantasy. Firstly, something that is historically unique to Japan is the hobby of collecting insects and keeping them as pets. And indeed, this roots back through history, with the 12th century folklore tale of the lady who loved insects being one such example. We also have later Edo period paintings of bugs and insects by Yamamoto Batsu being another key example. And a specific niche within this cultural phenomena is the collecting of beetles, and particularly rhinoceros beetles, for the purposes of fighting them, which was one of the prime inspirations for the Pokemon series, and it isn't a million miles away from the acquisition and fighting of these creatures as they appear in Final Fantasy. Beyond this, and part of the reason insect collecting is so historically ingrained in Japan, is the influences of Shinto, a polytheistic animist belief system that believes in spirits or kami, which are imbued in natural and elemental forces. So again, not a million miles away from the way that summons are envisioned across the Final Fantasy anthology, with specific creatures such as Ifrit, Shiva, Titan being tied to specific elements. So that's a very interesting glimpse into the creature acquiring, gotta catch 'em all sort of trope that recurs through these media, such as Pokemon and so on, very particular to Japan and very prevalent in the Final Fantasy games. Next, we have the influence that informs aesthetic, world building and narrative nods across the Final Fantasy games, which is Hayao Miyazaki's Studio Ghibli franchise. Now, the Ghibli films are a pop cultural powerhouse in Japan, and since the late 90s, thanks to a distribution deal with Disney, have become almost as prevalent in the West. Miyazaki's pioneering films began with an adaptation of his manga, Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, where he introduced large rideable birds called horseclaws, which Final Fantasy's chocobos make a clear visual reference to. But more broadly than that, Miyazaki's particular interest in vehicles and innovative airship designs and car designs, which feature throughout his films and range from relatively plausible, relatable Zeppelin-type craft to much more ambitious dystopian craft like the Goliath seen in Castle in the Sky. These designs have clearly influenced the consistent trend in Final Fantasy games to have obtainable airships, very ostentatiously designed sort of dystopian or steampunk airships, which have been around since 1987 in the very first Final Fantasy game, and very much the same in Miyazaki's films and manga. They've been around since Nausicaa and the Valley of the Wind. Beyond this, since his very first film, Nausicaa, which was inspired by industrial wastewater poisoning and killing residents of the factory town of Minamata in Japan in the 1950s, Miyazaki's Ghibli films have long wrestled with the impact of mankind on nature, the impact of technology on nature, which are evidenced time and again through the series, starting with Nausicaa and recurring in films like Pompoko, Princess Mononoke, so on and so forth. Beyond that, it's also fair to suggest Miyazaki deals with the generational trauma and fallout of nuclear war in his films. Nausicaa being set in a post-apocalyptic, post-nuclear dystopia, Grave of the Fireflies literally dealing with the final weeks of the Pacific War in Japan, and others such as Howl's Moving Castle having more abstract allusions to total war in its plot points. For its part, Final Fantasy borrows heavily on similar themes, overtly with the resource mining of Shinra in Final Fantasy VII, destroying the planet, the Esper processing of Gestalt in Final Fantasy VI, the Black Mages being fabricated in Final Fantasy IX, and the Machina of Final Fantasy X, all being suggestive of the negative impact of mankind on nature and this thrust towards harmful technology that mankind can have. And beyond this, we have Meteor threatening to destroy the planet in Final Fantasy VII, Sin destroying mankind in Final Fantasy X, the Lunar Cry in Final Fantasy VIII, the Terrans destroying planets in Final Fantasy IX, so on and so forth. We just have so many examples of extinction-level apocalyptic events taking place across the Final Fantasy games, either as major or minor plot points, that lean into this nuclear allegory that is rooted in Miyazaki's work as well, and of course Japan's modern history. Moving on, and in keeping with major plot influences on Final Fantasy, we have Star Wars. Now, Star Wars films have always been well regarded by the Final Fantasy team, in particular individuals like Yoshinori Kitase, who, in the games that he directed from Final Fantasy VI onwards, introduced the characters of Biggs and Wedge, named for two X-Wing pilots in Star Wars, and these guys became a recurring motif, a recurring pair of characters to feature in later games. Likewise, much has been made in the past of the design similarities between Final Fantasy's Black Mages and the Jawas from Star Wars, with both being cloaked figures with only yellow glowing eyes kind of popping out from their concealed faces, and even things as diverse and subtle as Squall and Heart's bandolier style belts in Final Fantasy VIII, echoing Han Solo's belts in the Star Wars films, or Final Fantasy XII's environments nodding to the aesthetic and the setting of Naboo, Tatooine and so on in the Star Wars films. More broadly, however, we have the central thrust of the Star Wars trilogy arc, which is a band of freedom fighters overcoming an expansionist imperial evil. We have broad strokes plot points of good versus evil, the hero's journey, and so on, and it's fair to say that these are aspects that most, if not all, Final Fantasy games in some guise or another tend to follow. So very overtly in games like Final Fantasy II, Final Fantasy IV, Final Fantasy VI, where we have an empire invading the free world, and then in other games where, for example, the power company Shinra is monopolising the free world through industry as a stand-in and a repackaged version of the classic Imperial Army trope. This, perhaps obviously in some ways, runs parallels with literary epics like Lord of the Rings, which George Lucas himself cited as an influence on Star Wars, and is another clear influence on Final Fantasy II. So the final key inspiration of note, I think, is the tabletop RPG Dungeons & Dragons. Indeed, such was the scale of the game's influence that most, if not all, of the bestiary in the original release of Final Fantasy was named for creatures that appeared in D&D, and the entire system of job classes, the way in which magic works, the focus on roleplay and character motivation, for which the Final Fantasy series became so renowned, roots back, as many RPG video games do, to this format of D&D gameplay. And as with all the aforementioned influences, they amalgamated and took on a life of their own within the Final Fantasy series. So there's a bunch more influences and inspirations we could touch on here. We could go all the way back to Dragon Quest and Ultima before that in terms of video game influences, which planted the seed of Final Fantasy into Hironobu Sakaguchi's mind and inspired many of the Squaresoft personnel to enter the games industry itself, some of which we've covered in previous episodes on Squaresoft personnel. We could touch more broadly on Japanese media, historical and mythological context, but I think the key touchpoints that comprise Final Fantasy, the Fellowship quest, the brand of science fantasy, and the moral, technological and natural world dilemmas that feature to some degree or another across all the games, can root back to these core influences that we've seen here and have helped elevate the games to the pioneering status of JRPG they're renowned as today. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the episode, please consider joining me on Patreon. Alternatively, if you feel like donating me a coffee, you can do so. The links are available below.